I don't think we need much of an introduction here, but Jamie Raskin is a member of the House of Representatives who represents the 8th Congressional District of Maryland. Before that, he was a state senator and a distinguished law professor specializing in constitutional law. On the last day of 2020, his 25-year-old son Tommy took his own life. Days later, Trump-incited rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol and tried to stop the certification of the presidential election and overturn the results. Of course, Representative Raskin was there for that, with one of his 2 daughters and his other daughter's husband. With his House and Senate colleagues, they lived through those harrowing hours. Afterward, Raskin led the effort to impeach Donald Trump for a second time, for having incited this insurrectionist riot, and he became the lead House impeachment manager during the Senate trial. That trial ended in a majority vote for conviction, 57-43. with 7 Republicans voting to convict. That was 10 votes shy of the 67 votes needed for a conviction, but it was the largest bipartisan vote for impeachment in U.S. history, that is, for impeachment conviction. He's now a member of the House committee investigating the January 6th riot. And Raskin has a new book out, #1 on Amazon, that chronicles his son's depression and death, the January 6th attack on democracy, and Raskin's own efforts to hold Trump accountable. The book is called Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. And before we start, I should say that Jamie and I are friends and neighbors. Our dogs are friends. I have a family member who once worked for him, and I knew Tommy. And like everyone who knew Tommy, I still grieve for him. So, forgive me, but I'm going to refer to Congressman Raskin as Jamie. Let's start with Tommy, if we may. You write a lot about him in the book. He was brilliant, funny, passionate, creative, empathetic, engaging, dynamic, and just damn smart. And we all say that about our kids, but it was truly the case for Tommy, and you do a marvelous job of capturing his spirit in the book. And what strikes me about him, that does make him, I think, different from a lot of other people, is that it seems from a very young age, he was a philosopher. He was always engaged with ethical dilemmas and moral challenges, and as he grew older, became a young man, he wrote poems and essays basically on his own, not necessarily for school, to explore moral questions and to advance his own moral vision. Not too many people do that. And one of those essays you quote in the book, I just want to read it to give people a sense of how Tommy came to some of these issues. And he wrote, "We may object to Trump's condescending rhetoric and galling outbursts about so-called shithole countries. But at the end of the day, we share in his general indifference to the preventable horrors that befall many inhabitants of these countries." That's quite a statement. It's quite an indictment. But it comes actually from, I think, a place of tremendous warmth and caring and compassion. And I wonder if, to give people a sense of Tommy, if you can talk about how he approached a very famous moral dilemma, which is called the trolley problem. You write about it in the book, and I just found it a very original way of looking at somebody.
Right. Well, first, thank you for having me, David. And let me say, Tommy was a philosopher from a very young age. He had a very strong libertarian sensibility in the fullest sense of that word. That is, he believed really strongly in freedom. I'll never forget the day when we saw a classmate of his who had been suspended for a week for some infraction or other, and he was on his way back to school, and Tom and I were walking on the other side of the street, and I said, look over there. There's Joe. They let him out of jail. And Tommy said, no, they let him back into jail. So he was always on the side of the underdog. He was always on the side of freedom. And he always wanted to look for the best in people. And the one thing he really hated was bullying and authoritarianism and fascism, But I do write about the trolley problem, and it was the last real essay that he wrote. And I should tell you, David, that when I turned this book in, it was 900 pages. It was twice as long as it was. And the editor said to me, "You've really written two books here. And one is a biography of your son, and one is the memoir of these 50 days in your life." And, that was the book that I had agreed to write with them. So I still have all this other material about Tommy that I will do different things with. And we are also in the process of putting together a book of Tommy's own writings, essays, plays, poems, and so on. But the trolley problem is posed usually to philosophy students something like this. There's a trolley that's headed to disaster and it's about to kill 500 people, and you are the last person that can do anything about it. You could flip a switch to change the direction and save 500 people's lives, but then you would, by doing so, deliberately be killing one person. And so, do you allow the train to keep going on the path that it was on and it has nothing to do with you, but 500 people will be killed? Or do you deliberately redirect it knowing that it's going to kill someone? And it's, of course, a famously unsolvable ethical dilemma. But Tommy said in this essay, what's interesting about it is that we equate the deliberate killing of one person to the passive acceptance of the deaths of 500 people. The moral tension comes from the fact that we feel they're basically equal on the scales, and he said, in the real world, we're not choosing between these two things. There are 500 people who will die today from starvation or malaria, and we can save them without killing anyone else and with very little or no harm to ourselves and with very little sacrifice. So Tommy got involved with a group called the Effective Altruists, and he basically gave away the vast majority of any money he made in different jobs, whether he was working as a cashier at a supermarket or working as when he was a law student in Harvard teaching undergraduate classes. And he felt death by starvation and illness by poverty as things that were cutting right into his soul and his body. And he wanted to give everything to groups like Give Directly and Amnesty International to help people. And by the way, he didn't limit his empathy to people because he felt it for animals too, and the animal kingdom and all sentient beings. He would pet our dogs, Potter and Toby and Zola, and he would pet them and he'd say, "Oh, Potter, you're such a fine sentient being." And so he was a passionate vegan, and he was not a guilt-tripping vegan. He tried to entice people into joining him by making great dinners or ordering them food from one of his favorite vegan restaurants, but he just felt like in the age of Beyond Sausages and Impossible Burgers, when our science has been able to simulate the taste for meat that we all hunger for, including Tommy, he said there's just no reason for anybody to depend on animal slaughter for protein anymore.
Now, I would recommend to our audience that they go online, which they are already if they're watching, and Google Tommy Raskin and Where War Begins. It's a spoken word poem that he performed that is quite impressive just in terms of its creativity. And it equates the violence against humans or compares it to the violence against animals, that is, with violence between humans. And when I saw it, I was just blown away just by the sheer audacity of the creative spirit behind it and his ability to perform it live. It's it's a remarkable piece of work, and I think it gives a great sense of of many aspects of his character. Now, I had a couple of political conversations over the years with Tommy. You couldn't bullshit him, right? You were always on your toes, and I wondered, after some of those, thinking about you and he together, if it was sometimes hard on you. I mean, in a good way, but challenging, because you had to be really, really smart when you were talking to Tommy.
Well, sure. And, I ended up giving up meat because, the only arguments I could muster against him when he first started coming at me about it were, well, animals eat animals. And he had just devastating refutation of that argument, and then it was like, the protein argument he can deal with very quickly. And then the argument, like, I've just grown up this way, it's my habit. He says, well, you've basically devoted your entire life to overthrowing social habits and conventions that encode injustice and unfairness to people. So it was out of sheer laziness that I was still eating meat, and he
Yeah.
talked me out. I mean, he created more vegetarians and vegans than anybody I know by far. And that poem itself that you cite, I agree, it's just a masterpiece. And it's all about how the conditioning of people to just accept eating animals lowers our resistance to violence against people and increases our indifference towards the suffering of other people. And I'd never seen that point made before. And certainly it's the most vivid statement of that position that I think anybody has ever made. And it's a remarkable contribution. And I mean, it gives you at least a glimpse at the measure of the loss, not just to our
Mhm.
family, but I mean to the world. That
Yeah,
we
well,
don't.
I would commend people who think about becoming vegetarians or vegans, or who are already, or who don't understand why they should be, to watch that. I mean, it's intellectually powerful, and I think trying to come up with a good argument against it is, as you know, as you just stated, rather hard. Now, you mentioned this a moment ago that Unthinkable, your book, is kind of two books in one. It's about Tommy and what happened to Tommy, and your grieving process for you and the whole family, for your wife Sarah and other your two daughters, Hannah and Tabitha. And it's also what happened to the country writ large on January 6th and the aftermath. Um, these seem to be pretty different events. One is very personal and intimate about one person and his family, and the other is an event involving thousands of people who we don't know, and the future of a democracy for 300 million people. At the time when all this was happening, and I realized it was a traumatic time for you. Did these events seem intertwined?
They did and they do, and I think they will be forever intertwined in my psyche and in my life. And I think as you read the book, you will find these striking connections. I mean, Tommy suffered from depression, which is a mental illness, and I tried not to run away from that. At the same time, that we obviously don't want to define Tommy with respect to that illness that he suffered. But that depression and that mental illness were exacerbated dramatically by COVID-19 and by the isolation and the demoralization of Tommy and his friends and his whole generation. I mean, there were skyrocketing levels of anxiety and depression and mental illness and alcoholism and drug abuse during, the Trump period generally, but certainly during COVID-19. Um, and the denial of COVID-19, the hawking of quack medical miracle cures, and just generally the trivialization of people's suffering um, created not just a dramatic coarsening of our public life, but they also created a way for the right wing in America to do business, to blank out the facts, to just deny reality. And just like they called COVID-19 for a long time a Democrat hoax, and then they said it would disappear by Easter, and then just the constant lying about it, that became habit forming in terms of their treatment of the election, until finally they could deny that Joe Biden was the real president, and they could say Donald Trump really won and the election has been stolen and it's a fraud and it's corruption, despite the fact that 62 federal and state courts rejected every allegation of electoral fraud and corruption, including 8 judges named to the federal bench by Donald Trump himself. And yet still, they say it to this very day. They said it yesterday on the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. And I was so glad that Joe Biden basically got mad and told the truth and said, we can't operate a democratic system on lies. And we can't have one political party position itself outside the constitutional order and show nothing but contempt and even violent contempt against the union and against our constitutional system.
Yeah. Let's turn towards January 6th and impeachment. We're learning more and more each day about Trump's plan to steal the election in the post-election period, and that he had a specific plan. And you've noted that that point is not made often and clearly enough. Can you elaborate?
There were 3 levels of activity going on. And this is what I argue in the book. There were 3 rings of activity, which is the way that I've seen it for a long time now. There was a mass demonstration that turned into a riot, and that some people were organizing to turn into a riot. But there were lots of people there who were there for innocent, nonviolent First Amendment purposes, just like there were many people in that level who also came ready to brawl and to fight. Okay, there was a second ring of activity, which was the ring of the insurrection. And these people came determined to commit violence, to smash out our windows, and to lead the mob into a storming of the Capitol and to lay siege to Congress. And in this ring, you'd find the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3 Percenters, the Aryan Nations, the militia groups, the First Amendment Praetorian, the QAnon networks. These were organized domestic violent extremist groups that came ready for battle and also intending to convert the outer ring of demonstrators into members of a mob prepared to riot against our police. And these 2 rings did the damage against our officers, 150 of whom ended up with broken jaws, broken necks, broken ribs, broken vertebrae, broken legs, broken arms, fractured skulls, traumatic brain injuries, and post-traumatic stress syndrome. 4 or 5 hours of violence leveled against our cops who saved our lives and saved our democracy that day. And so any of these phony right-wingers who claim to be law enforcement because they're willing to go out and speak up for a racist cop who beats up a young African-American kid cannot call themselves pro-law enforcement because they vanished when it came to defending our police, and they are not there now. In recognizing a bunch of my Republican colleagues voted against even extending the Congressional Medal of Honor to these law enforcement heroes. So give me a break with their pro-law enforcement rhetoric. That's
and
BS.
What's the inner ring?
The inner ring is the ring of the coup. And it's a weird word in American political parlance because we don't have experience with coups, and we think of a coup as something that takes place against a president. But this was a coup organized by the president against the vice president, against Mike Pence, and against the Congress and the election. And the whole point of this coup, having failed to convince Republican legislatures just to nullify the popular vote and install Trump electoral college slates, having failed to intimidate and overturn the decisions of state election officials, like Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who Trump tried to get to commit election fraud by just finding 11,781 votes. Having failed with all that stuff, then they trained their sights on Mike Pence, and they wanted him to declare lawless, unconstitutional powers simply to reject electoral college votes coming in from Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And if they could do that, they could lower Biden's total from 306 to below 270. And if they could do that, it would immediately trigger a contingent election, a so-called contingent election under the 12th Amendment. And why did they want to kick it into the House of Representatives where Pelosi was in charge and the Democrats were a majority? Because under the 12th Amendment, we vote not one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And at that point, after the congressional elections, they had 27 state delegations. We had 22. Pennsylvania was split down the middle. And even if they had lost, the Wyoming's at-large rep, Liz Cheney, which I think they would have, they still had a 26 vote majority. They would have pronounced him the president. At that point, Trump would have probably followed Michael Flynn, invoked the Insurrection Act, then called in the National Guard to put down all of the chaos and the violence, to pretend like he was somehow the hero of the day, and then seized the presidency for another 4 years.
So, I mean, and we have learned in the last couple of days from Peter Navarro, the White House aide, and others, that this was actually a master plan. That, preventing the certification, whether Trump wanted people to do it violently or not, but preventing the certification, first with Mike Pence, particularly, was key to this plan. It was a plan. It was an idea. And it wasn't just Trump flailing and decrying, the world for rigging the election against him. So, if I don't know if this question can be answered, but how close did they get?
Well, you saw how close they got. If Mike Pence had not been a constitutional hero on that day, which he was, then it would have happened. And who knows? In other words, the inside coup, or the self coup, as the political scientists call it, would have succeeded. The violent insurrection would have succeeded, and we perhaps would have been plunged into civil war. But we would have entered a very different form of government, something much more like a dictatorship. And the idea that we would ever have gotten him out seems very iffy to me. I don't know that we would have. So there were a lot of people who helped save us on that day. Mike Pence is probably on the top of the list. And then officers Gunnell and Dunn and Hodges and Fanone and all the others whose names we don't know as well, who put their bodies in the way. They helped save us. And then, the congressional leadership and the members who insisted on going back in and completing the count. There's a dramatic moment where Mike Pence, who was hiding out in an unknown, undisclosed whereabouts on Capitol Hill, was urged to leave the Capitol by the Secret Service. And he said, "I'm not getting in that car." He said, "I'm not leaving until we complete the count of the Electoral College vote." Because anything could have happened at that point.
It's kind of amazing that that it's possible that the security of the republic, the democratic nature of this country, was preserved by Mike Pence taking that stance. Now, people talk about prosecuting Donald Trump for January 6th and other things, and that's a pretty in-depth conversation. But right now, I'm not sure there's it's a strong legal case that he plotted to have the riot occur in order to help the plan. But I do think it's a pretty strong inference one can make from what we do know and what you and the committee have discovered, that Donald Trump saw the advantage of the riot once it was happening, that it was stopping the certification, which was something that Rudy Giuliani and others had talked about openly. We have to stop the certification today. And then he saw that this was happening and could lead to that part of the plan, whether it was something that he purposefully tried to design and to effectuate. Now, one question I had during the impeachment is that he, while the riot was happening, and as your committee has recently revealed, was sitting in the dining room next to the Oval Office, watching it on TV, doing nothing, and turning away his family members and members of Congress and aides who were saying, "Do something." Now, that to me is dereliction of duty, right? And,
Absolutely.
Right. And you mentioned that in the report that came up with the article of impeachment, that he incited the insurrection, but it wasn't an article of impeachment itself. And and I'm not sure if it's criminal, but it certainly is negligence, malfeasance. And is there a reason?
It's criminal in the.
And you don't have to prove it, because it happened, because we saw that it did not happen.
That's right.
So why was that not a sort of the centerpiece of the case for impeachment?
Well, first of all, it is a crime in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, dereliction of duty. It's not a statutory crime.
Mm-hmm.
Civilly, what I argued, you'll recall at the Senate trial, was that the dereliction of duty was built into the incitement. In other words, by inciting
Mm-hmm.
a violent insurrection and then doing nothing about it,
Yeah.
he had completely committed that crime. It's like a cop who decides to go and rob a bank. You prosecute him for bank robbery, but the dereliction of duty is built into the crime of robbing the bank
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. So, yeah, we're going to find out more about that. Obviously, we didn't know a whole lot about his specific whereabouts and what he was doing. We don't know exactly how much time, if any, he spent at that insurrection tailgate party they had, for example, with Mark Meadows, where they, had hot dogs and potato chips and they were, partying it up. We don't know exactly what he did, but for most of it, you're right. He was 30 seconds away from being able to walk into the Oval Office, get on TV, and to ask all of his followers to stop beating the hell out of our cops and to leave the Capitol.
Yeah.
But he didn't do it for more than 3 hours.
What's come out since the impeachment that you wish you knew at the time that could have bolstered your already strong case?
Well, we had Jamie Herrera Butler's statement of Kevin McCarthy telling his own story of begging the president to intercede. And we had in there Trump's response.
We should say she was a Republican member of
Congress. She's a Republican congresswoman from Washington State who said, Kevin McCarthy told me he called Donald Trump and essentially said, call off your people. You've got to put an end to this. Trump saying it's Antifa. McCarthy saying it's not Antifa, this is MAGA, these are your people. And then Trump saying, well, they effectively, I don't have the verbatim in front of me, but effectively he said, maybe they just care more about a fair election than you do, Kevin. What we are getting is voluminous evidence corroborating that kind of discussion where people are texting him, emailing him, calling him and Mark Meadows saying essentially, call off the dogs, and them not doing anything. But the truth is, David, that I think that we could have had 10,000 people testify to that. It wouldn't have made any difference because, of course, they hung their hat not on the facts. Mitch McConnell got up and said he is practically, actually, morally, ethically responsible for what just happened. But alas, we don't have the authority to try a former president, which was an utterly bogus argument that we had demolished on the first day of trial and which the Senate had rejected on the first day of trial. And yet, what I think McConnell was really telling us subtextually was he didn't have the votes and he never would have the votes to do it because Trump just exercised too much power over the GOP caucus.
Now, what will it mean if Trump ends up paying no penalty for this coup? He's still now the leading GOP candidate for 2024 and still eligible to run again. Do you think, and in your committee, all you can do is create information, and sure, you can't take action. It's not your role here. But do you think that Merrick Garland and the Justice Department should do something, or regarding Trump and the coup? And with Joe Biden's strong speech yesterday, do you think that he still has fully embraced and taken on this effort, or to deal with the crisis in democracy we have, of which this attempted coup is a strong element?
Well, look, Donald Trump's personal immunity and impunity is a long-running story that goes back many decades to him, ripping off contractors and painters and plumbers and electricians and the people who worked for him. I mean, he's a famous enemy of the working class in his own life and his own business operations. And he's gotten away with sexual assault. He's gotten away with sexual harassment, you name it. And it is maddening to people. And I share that. It is maddening to people. There's no doubt. But look, we are interested in personal accountability, and we need to be under a system of the rule of law in a democracy. And I hope that law enforcement, federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement will do their jobs. Okay. Having said that, one of the things we're trying to restore and rebuild is the proper relationship between the legislative branch of government and the executive branch of government, and specifically with respect to law enforcement. Donald Trump was somebody who had no problem trying to tell William Barr and the prosecutors, go prosecute this person or don't prosecute my friend or what have you. I mean, that's an obscenity. That's an absolute desecration of everything we've tried to build over the centuries here. So we're not going to get into that game. If there's evidence of crimes that comes to us, we will turn it over to the proper authorities. But there's another kind of accountability, David, which we are absolutely committed to, which is institutional and social accountability. We have a responsibility to make sure that a nightmare like January 6th never happens again. This is about democratic self-preservation. So our job is not just to make a report and gather the facts. Our job is to issue recommendations as to legal and policy changes that we need in order to fortify the institutions of democracy.
Going back to Tommy. Tommy is a strong presence through the book. It seems as if he's really with you in spirit. And as you face difficult decisions, the question for you often is, what would Tommy do? What would Tommy tell you to do? He was always a major advisor in your life, going back to even when he was in grade school and you first started in politics. So my question is, what critique do you think Tommy would have of the book?
Of the book? Well, I think he would say that what I don't deal with sufficiently in the book is the problem of war and the military-industrial complex. And I do talk about some of the tangles that Tommy and I got into when I would denounce Putin and his interference in our elections. Tommy, without denying any of it, was afraid that this kind of rhetoric could lead to a reheating of the Cold War, if you will. And Tommy was, as somebody who cared about humanity and human rights and human flourishing, he was most concerned about war as the devastation of people's hopes and people's lives. And so, and he rightfully would remind me of the way that in America, we have had a habit of wrapping some of our idealism and our liberalism and our zeal for human rights in military power. And I don't deal with that really in the book. I mean, I touch on it at a few different points, and I think he would want to press me on that. And all I can say to him is, Tombo, I'm not done yet, and I'm with him on this. I mean, militarism is a major threat to the survival of our species, and we just whatever you think about it, we can't afford it anymore because of the horrors of climate change. We have got to get the world together to confront climate change, and that gives us an opportunity of moving past it. I mean, Tommy believed that war would be something we would look back on like slavery or witchcraft, just a social practice that at a certain point, like meat eating, he hoped would just be something that we would leave behind. I mean, Tommy was like a messenger from the future. I mean, that's one of the only ways I can deal with his loss, is to think of him, as somebody who came from 500 years from now to talk to us about what the world could be like.
Well, Jamie, Congressman, I want to thank you for writing the book, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. It's brilliant. The writing style is superb. Your ability to share your inner grief and challenges and dilemmas with the rest of us and tie it into the national issues we face, both in terms of mental health and in terms of the health of our democracy, is impressive. And I encourage people to read it. You won't laugh much. You will cry. You will think a lot. So thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for writing the book. And I'll see you with Toby and Potter around the block soon.
Undoubtedly, I'll look forward to it. And thanks for reading the book, David, and paying such close attention to it and asking me that great question about Tommy, because I'm sure he would have more critiques, but that would undoubtedly be at the top of his list. Thanks, man.
Thanks.